Hey everyone! So if you've been around my corner of the internet, you've probably heard some form of the argument that veganism is only accessible for the privileged, and that pleading for everyone to go vegan is classist, elitist, colonialist, etc. In this video, I'm going to explore the concept of white veganism and discuss this idea that promoting an animal rights message is classist. First, if you're new here, I'm very outspoken about my progressive leanings, and it's no secret that I'm a Bernie bro. And I've made several videos on why I believe veganism should be intersectional, so check those out if you're interested. So what exactly is white veganism? Well, it depends who you ask. I've read many articles denouncing white veganism, some of which I agree with, and some of which I do not. The term white veganism came from applying the analysis of white feminism to the vegan movement. White feminism is defined as a brand of feminism centered around the ideals and struggles of primarily white women. While not outright exclusive, its failure to consider other women and its preoccupation with Western standards and the problems faced by the average woman is often alienating to women of color, non-straight women, trans women, and women belonging to religious or cultural minorities. So essentially, white veganism is promoting animal rights in a way that ignores or minimizes the struggles of oppressed minorities. I think it's important to reiterate that while not outright exclusive, its failure to consider the struggles of humans can be alienating to people of color and other minority groups. It's hard to measure the level of ignorance among vegans on other social justice issues, but it certainly exists and should be respectfully called out. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with being white and vegan. The problem is displaying ignorance, racism, or misogyny while representing veganism. White merely symbolizes dominance, so non-white vegans can in fact exemplify white veganism. However, many critics of white veganism are not vegan themselves, or they identify as vegan but express speciesist views that ignore or minimize the struggles of non-human animals. For example, here's a quote from an article titled "The Problem with White Veganism." "If you continue to impose your personal choice, however well-intentioned and admirable it may be, on indigenous people and people of color, your veganism is cultural colonialism." There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, culture is never a justification for violence, and consuming animal products is not a personal choice, as it involves a victim. The author is clearly forgetting about the victims of one's food choices. Also, we don't excuse other forms of discrimination like homophobia or sexism when it's coming from a person who belongs to an oppressed minority. So why excuse speciesism? If someone is caught abusing their dog, it doesn't matter if they're white, black, or brown, people are outraged. Yet carnism is so deeply ingrained in our culture that people fail to even register eating meat as animal abuse. But that's exactly what it is. It's needless violence. And to suggest that people of color shouldn't be held to the same moral standard as everyone else is a form of racism. Another thing that this accusation of cultural colonialism implies is that vegans are imposing their cultural preferences on indigenous communities and communities of color. This is simply not true. There are so many aspects of culture beyond harming animals. Culture changes with the zeitgeist. We uphold the good and ditch the bad. It would be a damn shame if Black and indigenous cultures were stamped out. But there is no imposition for people of color to completely assimilate with the dominant culture in the vegan message. This argument totally falls flat because although veganism is becoming more mainstream, the dominant culture is carnist. But let's say, for argument's sake, that the dominant culture was vegan. You can still be a proponent of multiculturalism without slipping into the danger zone of moral relativism. In other words, let's celebrate our differences when it comes to harmless expressions of culture, but violence should be done away with across the board. I understand that food is an important expression of culture, but many traditional meals can be veganized. It's funny when people say, like, "Oh, I'm insert whatever ethnic group here. Meat is a huge part of my culture. I could never go vegan." First of all, literally everyone says this, yet there are vegans across all cultural backgrounds, setting a beautiful example. Secondly, have you seen what white people eat? There's an awesome article titled "Why Veganism is Not a White Thing," which I'll link in my description box, but I wanted to briefly go over the 5 reasons listed. Number 1, abstaining from animal products is not a white concept. She cites Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, and Rastafarians as examples of cultures where principles of nonviolence were applied to food choices. Number 2, a lot of vegan staples like tofu, tempeh, lentils, textured vegetable protein, etc. came from non-white cultures. Number 3, for a long time it was easier to find vegan options at ethnic places than your typical American restaurant. Number 4, lactose intolerance is way more prevalent among people of color. Asians and blacks especially would see greater health benefits by excluding dairy from their diet. And number 5, the movement is growing, and there are many prominent vegans of color, including Angela Davis, Dexter and Coretta Scott King, Venus and Serena Williams, etc. As a movement, I think it's important to not tokenize, but prop up vegans of color. So in the interest of doing that, I wanted to give a shout out to my friend Sydney, who I met a couple years back in my yoga teacher training program. And before I moved out to Colorado, we got together and made a delicious dinner from the Afro Vegan Cookbook. And Sydney just started a vegan food blog, and I'm super stoked to try out all her recipes, so go give it a follow. Critics of white veganism will argue that vegans are so laser-focused on the suffering and exploitation of farm animals, yet they ignore the suffering and exploitation of the migrant workers harvesting their fruits and vegetables. This is a fair point if made by a vegan with the intention of raising awareness on the unethical nature of capitalism. But when it's made by non-vegans, it falls flat on its face because who do you think is operating slaughterhouses and factory farms? And where do you source your fruits and vegetables? What exactly is the solution you're offering? Because pointing at vegans and calling us self-righteous hypocrites is not how you wash the blood off your hands. Another point often brought up in these discussions is the supposedly inappropriate use of terms like slavery, rape, and Holocaust to describe what humans do to animals. I would judge the appropriateness of these terms and their associated imagery on a case-by-case basis. But to simply assert that animals are enslaved is not to morally equivocate Black people with cows, pigs, and chickens. And to say that we are all animals is not to say that a human being has the same moral value as an insect. Veganism does not necessitate that you value all species as equal. It's not necessarily speciesist to value the life of a human over the life of an animal, but it is speciesist to value taste, pleasure, and convenience over the life of an animal. The difference between humans and other species is far greater than the difference between races, sexes, and sexualities. There are many relevant differences between a human and a fish that justify placing the human above the fish in terms of moral importance. Degrees of sentience, capacity for well-being, intensity of social bonds with others, etc. However, there is no relevant difference between gay versus straight, black versus white, female versus male versus gender non-conforming that justifies placing a human belonging to one of these identities above another human. Animal rights advocates are not demanding that non-human animals have equal rights to humans, just that they have the basic right to freedom from exploitation and harm. By insisting that vegans should never, in any circumstances, use the word Holocaust because it supposedly trivializes the Jewish Holocaust, actually trivializes the animal Holocaust. The word Holocaust is defined as slaughter on a mass scale, and this is a perfectly accurate depiction of the animal agriculture industry. Refusing to call it what it is diminishes the severity of the issue. Alright, let's move on to the topic of class. Is veganism only for the privileged, or can everyone be vegan? First, let's define what it means to be privileged. A privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. Someone can be advantaged in some ways, but disadvantaged in other ways. For a more in-depth analysis of what privilege is and what it is not, go watch Knowing Better's Straight White Man's Guide to Feminism and Social Justice. 10 out of 10. When Bernie Sanders says that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, what he's saying is that income should have no relevance on the care that we provide people. Quality healthcare should be available to all citizens, not just the wealthy. But unfortunately, right now, healthcare is a privilege. In the same sense, I would argue that bodily autonomy is a right, not a privilege, and sex or species has no relevance. But right now, bodily autonomy is a privilege afforded to some, but not all. Non-human animals deserve basic rights and protections under the law, yet certain species, such as dogs and cats, are granted these rights, while other species, such as cows, pigs, and chickens, are treated as mere objects, legally classified as commodities. There is no moral justification for this classification. Non-human animals are so often forgotten and their worth so diminished that even good people who care deeply about social justice issues don't even consider them to be victims of oppression. If you spend time in the presence of these animals at a slaughterhouse vigil, for example, and look into their eyes, it will become undeniable that they are in fact victims of oppression. Once this paradigm shift occurs, you'll start to see the error in the way that veganism is so often framed. For example, privileged leftists love to bring up food deserts, arguing that promoting veganism is classist because in their view it's not accessible for the poor. But they fail to recognize that by definition, veganism is seeking to exclude all forms of animal exploitation as far as possible and practicable. If it were true that a 100% plant-based diet were impossible to adhere to, then one could still be an ethical vegan who excludes animal products as far as possible and practicable for them, given their circumstances. If you're homeless, literally no one is expecting you to pass up free food and starve. Veganism is not a diet, it's not about personal purity, it's a rejection of speciesism. Is it more challenging for underprivileged people to go vegan? Yes, and I think it's important to acknowledge this. Life in general is more challenging for the poor. Literally everything is more challenging if you're cash poor and time poor. Exercising, preparing healthy meals, parenting, getting enough sleep, staying sober, etc. But that doesn't mean that teachers and doctors should shy away from promoting the ideal amount of exercise, sleep, and alcohol because a healthy lifestyle isn't easy for everyone. Likewise, vegans shouldn't shy away from promoting veganism, but we should express interest in fixing the problems that make it more challenging for the working poor. Food deserts are an unfortunate side effect of unregulated capitalism, and what is needed is policy change and systemic reform. There are amazing vegan organizations like the Food Empowerment Project tackling this issue. The problem with food deserts, though, is not the lack of access to vegan food, but the lack of access to whole, unprocessed, healthy foods. It's ironic that carnists will claim that a vegan diet is nutritionally inadequate, but then turn around and associate veganism with healthy, fresh, organic produce. It's almost as if a vegan diet can either be healthy or unhealthy, depending on what it consists of. Contrary to what leftists on Twitter will have you believe, it is entirely possible to be vegan and poor. In fact, throughout human history in much of the world, a plant-centered diet was a peasant diet. Meat was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Today, animal products are artificially cheap due to government subsidies, but it's still true that beans and rice, pasta, potatoes, frozen vegetables, peanut butter are some of the cheapest foods in the grocery store. And plant-based options in food deserts are pretty much cost equivalent. Vegan food is available at convenience stores, fast food restaurants such as Burger King, Taco Bell, Subway, etc. There is a barrier to eating a healthy, balanced diet in these areas, but eliminating processed meat and cheese from your diet and replacing it with beans is only going to help, not hurt your health. Where there's a will, there's a way. But, as I said earlier, I understand that it's harder to muster up willpower when you're living below the poverty line. A lot of people in these communities struggle with obesity and food addiction, and taste equivalent alternatives to their favorite comfort foods are limited and unaffordable. Imagine living back in 1970 before any of your favorite vegan comfort foods such as Gardein were even invented. It was totally doable, but objectively more challenging. You gotta admit it required more effort then than it does today. Being vegan is way easier than most people think it is, but change is not easy for everyone. The book Hand to Mouth really opened my eyes as to why poor people make so many bad decisions. I don't think personal struggles are a legitimate excuse for supporting animal abuse, but I am a bit more reserved in my judgment than I am of wealthy people who have fewer barriers and preach about the importance of personal responsibility. In conclusion, the animals we use for food, clothing, and entertainment are victims of horrific brutality and oppression. Belonging to a marginalized group and experiencing oppression does not give anyone the right to oppress others. Of course, we should all strive to do the right thing, even when it's difficult. But those of us who are privileged and find being vegan easy, I think we should strive to help make it easier for others in whatever ways that we can. Thank you so much for watching. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And I'm looking forward to reading all your comments. Alright, see you next week.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, nah, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, nah, no meat.